Welcome, everybody. Delighted to see you all. My remarks will be very brief, but I'm very delighted to have this opportunity. I do recall that back in the early 1960s, when I first actually went to Afghanistan myself, the very name of the country was virtually synonymous with remoteness, a sort of Asian version of Timbuktu. In the 50s and 60s, the U.S. State Department even had a transitive verb to Afghanistan somebody. Meant essentially to banish somebody to the virtual far side of the moon. But there was a small group of American scholars who took this country very seriously, learned Dari, or Pashto, and genuinely loved the country, its rich culture, its hardy and indomitable people. Some of these Americans, like art historian Michael Berry, were romantics and activists in the style of T.E. Lawrence. In the 80s and 90s, for example, Berry delivered humanitarian assistance to Afghan peoples and reveled in such adventures as riding horseback from Mazar-e-Sharif to Herat, as he himself told me. Then there were people like Louis Dupre, who spent much time in Afghanistan in the 60s and 70s as a hands-on archaeologist. The same was true, of course, of his wife, Nancy. A well-known historian and utterly devoted to the people and the history of Afghanistan, she would go on to direct the Afghanistan Center at Kabul University. Like Berry and the two Dupres, Ludwig Adamec also fell in love with the sheer power of Afghanistan, its sweeping landscapes, its rich culture, and of course, its people. This would have been 1952, just several years after he had left his native Austria. That trip obviously had a huge impact on him. By 1954, he was studying Middle Eastern history at UCLA under the direction of Gustav von Grunebaum, who was a fellow Viennese. And over the course of the following decade, he made several trips back to Afghanistan to gather material for his dissertation, which he completed in 1966. The next year, he came to the University of Arizona, where he was located in the Department of Oriental Studies. And I have to say, he was the very first member of that department, in fact, the first faculty member, I think, whom I remember meeting when I first joined the university myself in 1972. Throughout his long and productive career, Ludwig made many contributions to the study of this country that he loved so much. I won't review them all here, all the books that would take up virtually the whole evening we have. So instead, I simply display them here on the screen and make a few passing remarks. The time span represented by these publications from 1967 to 2012 covers 45 years of productivity that is consistent, focused, and prodigious. His first book, Afghanistan 1900 to 23, was a revision of his UCLA dissertation. Ludwig was among the first American scholars to broach upon a field theretofore dominated by British scholars, who of course regarded Afghanistan as part of Britain's imperial backyard. In that first book, Ludwig argued that after World War I, the country was not just a pawn of Britain's great game with Russia. To the contrary, he showed how the country's leaders had skillfully managed to play those powers off against each other. For that study, he made use not only of British Indian records that had just become available to scholars, but also of German archival records, which showed how the Emir of Afghanistan managed to outmaneuver the Germans as well as the British and Russians. Ludwig then edited a 6-volume set of comprehensive surveys, you see them here, based on the British Gazetteer of Afghanistan, originally compiled in 1871 and updated until a few select copies were finally printed in 1914. Owing to its politically sensitive nature, it was never published until after India's independence in 1947, and Ludwig was the first person to tap its rich database. His edition came with 3,400 pages and some 340 contour maps. His book, Afghanistan Foreign Affairs in the mid-20th century, was something of a sequel to his first monograph, which had stopped in 1923, in the sense that it too brought in the fascinating story of the German angle, specifically how the Nazi high command had tried but failed to distract both Russia and Britain from Europe by trying to win over the leaders of Afghanistan. In 1975, he published his Who's Who, and in 1987, his biographical dictionary. These comprise the most thorough biographies ever published of Afghan figures between World War I and 1978. Now, when the Soviets occupied Afghanistan in the 1980s, the country suddenly found itself in the international spotlight. By the time the third edition of his historical dictionary was published in 2003, America too had become involved shortly after the 9/11 attacks. Now, journalists, pundits, and even politicians all rushed to learn about Afghanistan. By this time, of course, Ludwig's work was already out there, available both to the American public and the governing classes. His life's work had suddenly become relevant to everybody. From this point on, Ludwig would work hard to keep up with fast-breaking current events, such as by bringing out new editions of his historical dictionary. You notice that each new edition published between 91 and 2012 was longer than the previous one, with the last edition nearly double the length of the first. This involved bringing into his study the various Mujahideen groups, their leadership, ethnic composition, orientation to Islam, and so forth. Ludwig's historical dictionary to Afghan wars, revolutions, and insurgencies, published in 1996, clearly reflects this concern with current affairs. When seen in its totality, then, Ludwig's scholarly output clearly reveals a trajectory. His early work focused on reconstructing the diplomatic history of the early 20th century. But as the turmoil in Afghanistan gathered momentum from the 1990s onward, his work progressively evolved into tracing the political and military history of his own times, of our own times, indeed. From this, it becomes clear that while Ludwig will always be missed by his many friends and colleagues, his work will surely endure. So it is in this context that I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Shah Mahmoud Hanifi. Dr. Hanifi is a professor of history at the James Madison University. He had received his PhD from the University of Michigan. He has received grants also from the Social Science Research Council, the Council of American Overseas Research Centers, the American Historical Association, and more. He is probably best known for his two major publications. His first monograph came out in 2011, Connecting Histories in Afghanistan, Market Relations and State Formation on a Colonial Frontier. So this book explores 19th century economic history of Afghanistan, challenging the conventional political, diplomatic, military approach of the great game between Russia and Britain. It looks at the trade relations between three market centers, Kabul, Kandahar, Peshawar, with a view to unpacking the impact of British commercial policies on Indian bankers and Afghan nomadic groups. His most recent book came out just this past year, 2019, is Mount Stuart Elphinstone in South Asia, Pioneer of British Colonial Rule, published by Oxford University Press. Now, Mount Stuart Elphinstone is one of the more colorful as well as important figures in South Asian history. He really comes at the very cusp of the British Raj, the very opening when the British were trying to come to understand this vast subcontinent that they were becoming increasingly engaged with. And Elphinstone was dispatched as the first diplomatic mission by the East India Company to Kabul, way off beyond the Khyber Pass. And he published in 1815 his first book, which was very important in kind of structuring the relations and the understanding of the British of what was beyond the Punjab. And this is exactly what Professor Hanifi's book is indeed unpacking, a very important study. In addition to these, Professor Hanifi has published the Pashtun Counter-Narrative, articles, Shah Shuja's Hidden History, Impoverishing a Colonial Frontier. Book chapters include a book history of an account of the Kingdom of Kabul, that's Elphinstone's book, a genealogy of Orientalism in Afghanistan, the colonial image lineage, and a history of linguistic boundary crossing within and around Pashto. Professor Hanifi's teaching areas are modern Middle East, global South Asia, Afghanistan, colonialism, and world history. But his research interests are very, very broad indeed. They extend from not only Afghanistan, but also the Persian world, Pashto, colonialism, nationalism, tribal history, nomadic societies, Islamic urbanism, historical linguistics, migration, diasporas, identity formation, cartography, photography, environmental studies, and last but not least, animal studies. And here I'd like to mention what he has an online book chapter entitled Elephants in Afghanistan, Surveying the History of a Pachyderm Frontier. In this context, I simply cannot resist demonstrating Professor Hanifi's enthusiasm for animal studies, especially the pachyderm. I'm happy to present to you a photograph of Professor Hanifi engaging here with an elephant, I believe in Thailand. Another one, just to give you a sense of his enthusiasm for animal studies. And I close with this one, which I think can be described as Professor Hanifi having a very good day. It is in this context, then, that I'm very pleased to have the honor to introduce to you Professor Hanifi, who is going to be lecturing to us on Ludwig W. Adamec and the architecture of Afghanistan studies, building a national history on transnational realities. Please welcome me, please join me in welcoming Professor Hanifi.
Well, thank you so much, Dick and Ann, for the introductions, and thank you, Julie and Kamran and others in this room for your really amazing hospitality. It's an absolute life career privilege to be here to discuss Professor Adamec's work. To be associated with him is truly humbling, and I'm most grateful for the opportunity. And it's very clear to me that Professor Adamec left a really, just a rich and dense set of personal relations here that I'm sure brought you all to this room. And it's very evident just on the surface that his memory is still very much alive and enduring. And I know that institutionally, his institution building here at the center, the original founding director for the Center for Middle Eastern Studies, is again just such a lasting tribute to his really amazing career, and just wonderful to be here. I'd like to try to give you a sense of how this talk will move. It'll be heavy imagely. I've become addicted to PowerPoint and can't help but probably having typically too many images than are necessary. But I'll warn you of that as we begin, that we'll be going through a lot of images. I'd like to start with just a couple of intersections between Professor Adamec and myself and family, en route to, again, reviewing to some extent what Dick has already laid out in outline form, the sort of scope of Professor Adamec's work. And I'll focus on a few of his publications and try to say a bit more about them, and then elaborate on the themes that he's addressing. And I really look forward to this opportunity. The kindness of Professor Adamec that brought you here is reflected, I think, around the world. I was a very young professor when I received this unsolicited note from a giant in the field. And it was Professor Adamec writing to me to share. It was the Dictionary of Afghan Wars and Insurgencies that he sent a copy of to me, unsolicited. And I can't tell you how, again, stunned and impressed I was that such a giant would reach out to such a young, unknown person. And I can say, in many ways, Professor Adamec's work has directly shaped my career in ways that I hope to explain. All ways maybe except the elephant, which requires a different context. Has reached all classes of people interested in Afghanistan, and some of his items have been translated into Persian and here in Urdu. This is his second book that was translated into Urdu and now has a home at the University of Wisconsin. And again, I see Professor Adamec's handwriting here. Another note to a person I can't figure out who it is, but I'm sure Leslie, most likely a lady, would have been as truly touched by receiving this as I was when Professor Adamec wrote to me. And it really, again, amplifies his generous and giving spirit that I know animates this room. I wanted to say, I know we have Dr. Atifa Rawan here, who is the librarian specialist and will recognize this collection of online resources available through the University of Arizona and Afghanistan Center at Kabul University, a wonderful project. Again, speaks to the Mecca that Arizona State is for Afghanistan studies, to use that metaphor. Professor Adamec's collection is fantastic. Many of the items that Dick displayed are available here. 2 of the gazetteers are available here. And it's just a wonderful resource. But it's not Professor Adamec's resource that I want to draw attention. It's Professor Mobeen Shorish's collection that I just want to say a word about. And in so doing, just expand upon the connections between my father and Professor Shorish and here at Arizona. And what this reminds me of is sort of, in Afghanistan, there are all kinds of connections, and people spend a lot of time figuring out their kinship and other kinds of connections, and maybe that's what I'm trying to do here. It turns out that my father, on his first journey, and it is absolutely important to recognize that Professor Adamec's life was full of amazing journeys, geographic, cultural, intellectual, and that brings us to my father's journey out of the country on an Afghan government scholarship to come and study here. On that journey, he was accompanied by Mobeen Shorish. And those journeys generate all kinds of stories, and our family's folklore really reflects the stages of this journey. Kabul to Kandahar, Zahedan, Tehran, Paris. It's just the whole set of experiences that Professor Shorish and my father shared is really important. And I've been working in the National Archives in College Park, where I found the intake records of not just my father and Professor Shorish, but between 1951 and 55, I've counted 86 Afghans studying in the United States. And I want to say something about that circuitry, that educational circuitry, in due course here. Professor Shorish has a daughter named Yasmin Shorish, who has now arrived at my university. So it's one of the strangest coincidences that our fathers traveled out of the country and now we find ourselves in the same university. And I wanted to share that coincidence with you, as well as just a couple of other ways in which, although I did not know Professor Adamec, he knew me. I appear in some of his publications as the son of my father who appears in his publications. Indeed, I have a number of relatives that appear and associates that appear in Professor Adamec's work. And so in that way, I want to emphasize that Professor Adamec's work about Afghanistan has helped me learn about myself as well as Afghanistan. And for that, I'm really forever grateful. Indeed, a couple of the rich genealogies in here have relatives of mine, and in sort of querying my father about the relationships diagrammed here, I ended up learning a lot more about my own family history I just had no idea about. And again, that's thanks to Professor Adamec getting me started in asking these kinds of questions about connections and relationships. And perhaps later I can explain the precise connections. So the first part of this talk, what I'd like to do is sort of embark from Professor Adamec's early works on diplomatic history that are really predicated on the idea of independence and Afghanistan's independence. And what that means is that Afghanistan now has an ability to kind of act on its own, on itself. In other words, use the map and act on the map of Afghanistan kind of and by and for Afghanistan. Independence meant being able to act on one's own territory in new ways and make new connections between the outside world and Afghanistan. And although it's 2020 now, perhaps we're still in the sort of the shadow of a centennial celebration. Afghanistan's 100-year centennial of independence in August was celebrated around the world, and most often it's narrated through the King Amanullah and his wife Soraya. And Professor Nawi is the expert on this period, who is here. And also, I must be clear that my Elphinstone book is an edited book, and I must say how honored I am to have Professor Nawi in that book as well. I would like to propose that independence is, and I want to be careful here, but there's a bit of a myth to it. Because what independence, to my eye, did was open up Afghanistan to new and different and more intense dependencies. In fact, I find the forms of dependencies that Afghanistan had prior to independence were elaborated and intensified during the so-called era of independence. And we see that in a number of ways. We see that economically, we see that administratively, we see that in terms of clothing, food, architecture, a whole new range of influences from the outside world took hold in Afghanistan as a result of independence. Here is a photograph of the Afghan delegation and the British delegation in Mussoorie, India, as they were negotiating. Professor Adamec outlines the complex steps that it took for the Afghan elites to negotiate with the British the nature of this new relationship. And I wanted to be sure, if you'll excuse me, I'll try to find my clicker, to indicate Professor Dobbs, the British Dobbs, who is the subject of much of Professor Adamec's writings. And I want to be sure to emphasize that Mussoorie, as a hill station in northern India, has an Afghan history. Mussoorie and Dehradun, sort of the major city near Mussoorie, has a really profound connection and history to Afghanistan and Afghans in these areas. And what we can see, as opposed to the former picture, which was, I guess, a staged, and this is staged also, but we have now what's about to happen in the context of these diplomatic negotiations is a banquet and a party and a sort of, not quite celebration, but new kinds of cultural practices are taking shape as a result of independence. And we have a wonderful visual kind of archive of this era. That is the 1920s broadly, the teens and 20s. There are thousands of photographs of this era of Afghanistan's history available online, including this sort of interesting set of postcards that recycle the pictures that are displayed at the Savoy Hotel. And these postcards give us a sense of some of the new architecture in a sort of new satellite capital, Pagman, where Amanullah was born, and new kinds of, clearly, parks and buildings, new kinds of monuments modeled directly on the Arc de Triomphe here on the left. It's sort of, that's the gate welcoming visitors to Pagman, a memorial to those lost in the Third Anglo-Afghan War. And so what we see here are new kind of a physical infrastructure taking shape very much along Western lines. And it's these lines that give us the dependencies I referenced earlier. What we see also in Pagman is not just architecture, but a number of new kinds of social practices and public events. Most significantly, the celebration of Afghan independence known as Jeshan. And it's in these Jeshans where all sorts of interesting things happen. For example, the very important issue of veiling and deveiling is sort of announced and performed in Pagman. All kinds of new agricultural fairs here in Pagman. And we have what becomes essentially the first sort of constitutional infrastructure, a parliament in the making in the form of a Loya Jirga, where representatives from around the country come to Pagman in 1924 and are engaged in discussing and validating the extensive reforms that Amanullah undertook. And what we see is these members of the Loya Jirga, who are chosen and paid to arrive in their own costumes. What they are given is a state uniform. And this is highly symbolic for the kinds of transformations that we're speaking of when we talk about Afghan independence and new kinds of behaviors politically and socially. These commercial fairs that began in Pagman, the Jeshans rather, where commercial fairs were held, the Jeshans moved from Pagman to Kabul, and these commercial fairs continued each Jeshan, and American kind of corporations and contractors ended up having a place at the Jeshans. And it's really here in the 1950s that the United States gets heavily involved in Afghanistan through the Helmand Valley Project, many of you know about. And I'd like to kind of get there eventually to this era. What we see is, again, a large number of Europeans themselves, European dresses and styles, costume balls and theaters, not only in Pagman, but another new architecture in Kabul. We see new technologies, new furniture, new aesthetic sort of sensibilities taking shape here in the 1920s in particular. Really dramatic, new groups of students being sent abroad during this period, the 20s in particular, but into the 30s and beyond until today, where the University of Arizona hosts Afghan intellectual scholars and students with what appears to be some routine, or perhaps could be more routine. This is a photograph from the Habibullah era, before Amanullah, of the Mohammedzai clan. And what you're looking at here is essentially the political and commercial and intellectual elite of the country, the families, the Mohammedzai, right at Balboa's grave, which I wanted to make sure you were aware of. The next part of this talk, I'd like to, if possible, move in a bit more detail into some of Professor Adamec's work and connections to myself, my career, and my family. When I was a graduate student, I entered the University of Michigan, and I went to the Center for, then I believe it was Near Eastern Studies, a young student interested in Afghanistan. The first thing I see is this book on the left, a book that Professor Adamec edited and contributed to, and it brought him to Ann Arbor for a summer. And I ended up getting a job at that center in the publications department and would mail out publications, and I would have the great pleasure of mailing this book out. And so Professor Adamec sort of arrived on my intellectual map on day one of my tenure as a graduate student. The middle books are the two gazetteers on Kabul and Kandahar that are available online that I should say set the stage for my future career. I spent years with these books at the University of Michigan organizing my thesis work, and I'd like to say something about them and their maps as we get going. The question of the dictionaries, of which there are so many, and so much valuable information. I first want to say that most of those dictionaries do not have pictures. The one that does is the one here. On the back of this biographical dictionary is Professor Adamec's picture. That's how I knew Professor Adamec. I envisioned him like that my whole life until recently when I saw a number of other photos. But that's the image of Professor Adamec I carried around. That's the image of my father in this dictionary, and that's the little blurb about my father, and that's where I appear. And what's important about that particular installment of the dictionary is it contains photos that form the sort of intellectual circles in Kabul that Professor Adamec would have engaged. And this might be perhaps the top tier of leading historians that Professor Adamec would have known and worked with. Indeed, Professor Kakar and Professor Adamec had an exchange in the Ijmas Journal, run by the Middle East Association, where there's kind of a debate about Elphinstone's book, of all things. And I'll say something about that in due course. Again, I can see these names, and some of these names are familiar to you all. I should say, in broad measure, those, except for Abdul Hayy Habibi, largely wrote in Persian. And this would be a sampling of sort of intellectuals writing in Pashto, but also Persian. I just wanted to be clear that those circuits both overlap and diverge in important ways that are worth mapping historically and sociologically. It's my hypothesis, and I look forward to being corrected by those who actually shared Professor Adamec's life with him, what I'd like to sort of present to you as the German connection here. I want to now try to bring out, just very briefly, how significant this German connection is for Afghanistan. In fact, Professor Adamec's contribution to the New Approaches book we just saw was about the German presence in Afghanistan. And I've always wondered about that, knowing something about Professor Adamec's life, being raised and born in Vienna, which I guess is Austria. But I know there's a complex relationship between Austria and Germany historically, and language dialects and diglossia, sort of a similar situation to Afghanistan, not to mention the alpine environment of these locations in the world. And I've often wondered if it was Professor Adamec's upbringing in a kind of alpine-esque region that made Afghanistan so familiar to him as time wore on. These are two Afghans who were trained in Germany and had tremendous influence on Afghanistan. And Ghulam Muhammad Farhad was the mayor of Kabul, among other ministerial appointments, a very high-ranking administrative official in Afghanistan, and I'll show you a little bit about it. Brezhnev is arguably the foremost artist in Afghanistan's history. I'm happy to be corrected, but he really established a sort of visual culture and a visual history for Afghanistan that I'd like to, again, draw out just a little bit. First, with Ghulam Muhammad Farhad and his role as the mayor of Kabul, the most significant impact here is the Jade Maiwan. That is the very new and modern, straight, large street that most of you who have been to Kabul have memories of, or at least experience with. This is a transformation of an urban environment. And again, my father lived through the period when this road was sort of, bulldozed through other parts of the city, and not all of the city was evidently. But there's a history to this road that's worth exploring in a sense. And this German influence in Afghanistan that we can, in some ways, chart the beginning of with Ghulam Muhammad Farhad continues right up, obviously, until today in some ways. This is from the 1960s, a set of maps of Kabul, where it's not now just roads, but it's all kinds of electricity and sewage infrastructures. The attempt to bring sewage to Kabul wasn't successful. But they were working on this, the Germans, kind of urban renovation and modernity. These are maps from the 1960s when Germany was heavily involved in forestry in eastern Afghanistan, Kunar and Paktia in particular. And such an important period, German maps. Professor Eaton is to blame for bringing elephants up, but I'm happy that we had a chance to do that, because in my paper that I wrote on elephants, I ended with a story that I thought it was based on facts as I knew them, of an Afghan elephant that died in Louisiana. The last Afghan elephant dies at the Baton Rouge Zoo, or so I say in my elephant paper in its first version. I quickly received, after riding an elephant and feeling that I've kind of culminated my study of the elephant with that ride, I got an email from a German zoologist who spent many years in Kabul helping to develop the Kabul Zoo, trying to develop a museum of natural history, crafting relations with Kabul University faculty in zoology and botany, generating a whole sort of series of intellectual migrations between Afghanistan and Germany. And it turns out the last Afghan elephant was a gift from the government of India and died during the Civil War in 1992. So I've been corrected by a German zoologist about the elephant, and in my revisions of this paper, I came so very happily to encounter in the online version of the Kabul Times here at the University of Arizona a kind of public record of this arrival of the elephant. And again, that just made me think how lucky Arizona is to have had Professor Adamec and have all the Afghanistan resources that you contain here. Moving to Brezhnev and the visual history of Afghanistan, this is arguably the most famous picture Brezhnev drew of the coronation of Ahmad Shah Abdali Nurani, and the Sufi Sabir Shah putting the sort of wheat, still a symbol on the Afghan flag, on Ahmad Shah's head. At the time of this image being created, a new text was being created. Ahmad Shah Baba, a new history of the first ruler. And I want to emphasize that the images that we will see and have seen of Krishna are correlated with a number of new texts about Afghan history that are taking shape at the same time. And so what I'd like to impress upon us in studying Afghanistan, that images and texts and indeed maps all need to be seen sort of holistically. And Professor Adamec's work helps us see those relationships. Krishna gave the Afghan populace a sense of their own history. And again, the complex relationship between Afghanistan and India begins with Sultan Mahmud Ghaznavi, becomes more complicated in terms of identities and relationships, Sher Shah Suri, and again the Hotas, Mirwais and Shah Mahmud in the 18th century. Krishna is creating these images based upon German artistic training and sensibilities, and it's really remarkable, for example, indeed, how similar these guys look. It looks like they really should be in the same genealogical tree. And I think we need to be a bit kind of critical about the great sort of scope of 800 years of shared beard features, for example. So, like text, images can be critically analyzed. And let's remember that images, particularly photographs, carry high resonance in Afghanistan, which is a largely very low literacy rates. Images carry a higher sort of impact in areas where there's not much reading, as it were. And here we have an electoral ballot. I believe this is from the previous election, not the recent one. And again, images, just a photograph and a symbol, are so powerfully important, they can indeed determine the course of national histories. I believe this is the recent ballot. It appears to be a draft, so I'm not sure what the final ballot is. Julie, I may need your help to navigate to what I would like to show you. If we now understand Professor Adamec arriving in Afghanistan in 1952, there's some information about him coming through Herat and an electrical station in Herat. That's somewhat problematic for me because I understood there not to be electricity in Herat at that time. And in the obituary for Professor Adamec in the newspaper Omaid, an Afghan government publication, there's of course reference to you, Mrs. Adamec, but also the role of Ghulam Muhammad Farhad in helping to facilitate Professor Adamec's presence and activities in Afghanistan. And in 1952, that's a very significant year because what is issued at the government's behest voluntarily are what's known as Afghan identity cards, or the tezkira, the Afghan kind of passport known as the tezkira, developed in 1952, and I'll show you my father's tezkira in just a second. But from 1952 then to 1954, I'm just so fascinated and I hope to learn more about what exactly happened. How did Professor Adamec sort of wind up at UCLA so quickly? And this is where I just wanted to show you some US government documents. I'll just scroll through them rather quickly to get to a list in 1952 of 10 Afghans known to be studying, in this case, in the United States. And what we see is a very active interest in United States organizations and corporations, the Morrison Knudsen Company, to facilitate the education of Afghans, in engineering in particular, and particularly hydraulic engineering, kind of irrigation sciences in the 50s. And we see all kinds of statistics about the cost, excuse me, here. And again, government documents have certainly more than you need, but the sort of breakdown of the cost, how much does it take to get, and it's the kind of thing I know, and you must be doing when you have visitors. What's it cost for a flight? What's it cost for a hotel? How do we do this? Where's the money coming from? And what we see in this context, these are records from 1952 and 4, those years, where there's an active interest in getting Afghans abroad. There's discussions about sort of cost saving. Why send them to the United States when they can go to the Middle East? Let's say the American University of Beirut, where key figures such as Ashraf Ghani, current president, Zalmay Khalilzad, a number of other current Afghans, circulated through the American University of Beirut. That clearly wasn't Professor Adamec's path. Hunter College, Roberts College rather, in Istanbul was another sort of discussion point. And basically I wanted to show you these to raise questions about precisely how it is that Professor Adamec got to UCLA. And I hearken back to not kinship as much as sort of old connections, call them geographic or social, but the major figure at UCLA at that time is Gustav von Grünebaum, who is an Austrian. And I just wonder if the Austrian connection had something to do with this. Maybe I'll learn later. But as I hypothesize about all of this, there's just so many questions and clues to pursue. And that's all I really wanted to do with these US documents, because clearly Professor Adamec would have had to have had sort of clearance and permission and funding to make all of this happen. Okay, so this would be the identity card issued to my father in 1952. Okay, and what's most interesting about the Tezkira from this age is the format of it is in Pashto. The headings, the titles are in Pashto, but all of the responses and writing are in Persian. And again, this highlights that complex relationship between these two languages, texts, and again, what's important here is there is another slide where it's the question of naming here. And in the 1940s, the initiative to have a last name, sort of a takhalus it's called, was put forth. And that was really only used if you were leaving the country. So my father's Tezkira did not have our last name Hanifi on it until later when he was leaving the country, and you can see it written in. And I can show you a separate slide of that later. The point here is the consistency. There's so many examples of Afghans either changing their name, changing the spelling of their name, going by a new name, all of which poses enormous methodological problems for Professor Adamec when he's generating dictionaries and genealogies, trying to figure out who's who. People get referred to by, it's kind of a nickname thing in Afghanistan called the laqab. There are last names, first names. Just the concept of naming is such a challenge. And I'm so in awe of Professor Adamec for sort of surmounting the nomenclature challenges that Afghanistan offers in generating his work. I'd like to turn to the gazetteers, which are a product primarily, as Professor Eaton mentioned, of British records, okay? But they are expanded and elaborated and developed in concert with Afghan records, primarily from the annuals of the Kabul magazine, of which we have one example here. So those gazetteers have kind of an Afghan epistemology lineage as well as a British. And I want to just highlight on the maps here, and I will try to sort of move quickly. But each of those 6 volumes has a set of maps. There appear to be hundreds of these maps. Each volume has a kind of shared legend, and this legend has a number of things that really don't apply to Afghanistan. And so what we have to look at as this body of information being framed from an imperial perspective that had kind of global application. And so how the maps were coded and sort of signified has to do with, except for its ecology, a number of issues that really don't relate to Afghanistan. But again, this speaks to the connections between a kind of national history and internationalism that takes shapes under independence. Okay, so very quickly, I just want to address Mount Stuart Elphinstone's map of the Kingdom of Kabul. We must remember, Afghanistan, although the category Afghanistan existed and was used, it was subordinated to the idea of Kabul and the Kingdom of Kabul. And Elphinstone's book is not Afghanistan, it's a Kingdom of Kabul. And the map of the Kingdom of Kabul, which we can read as the first map of Afghanistan in some ways, went through a number of sort of changes over the course of Elphinstone republishing his work, like Professor Adamec, multiple times. The first publication is 1815, then 1819, then 1839, where again, like Professor Adamec, leading up to the first Anglo-Afghan War, reading material was produced and circulated, and it was Elphinstone's book that became the handbook for the First War. And there's a map story just to be said here. The first thing to note, this is the map in question. And you can see it's not as sophisticated as we would think from today. But the mapping that Elphinstone did was connected to a larger mapping project of India, led by James Renault, the master mapper of British India. And so what you can see here is that Afghanistan is kind of not, it's faintly on the map of British India. And Elphinstone is basically bringing this region into the cartographic space of British India. Elphinstone had to petition his superiors to publish that map because of the fear of a French invasion, which spawned Elphinstone's mission, also led to questions about publishing the map in case the French needed to use it, wanted to use it to invade. So Elphinstone had to draw attention to this map from George MacDonald Kinnear that was published earlier that has those strategic passes and spaces kind of on the map. So Elphinstone has to reference this earlier map to get his map published in the first instance. Elphinstone ends up revising his map in the second edition in 1819. Then, in the 1830s, a very famous figure named Alexander Burns spent years in and around Afghanistan, writing just a wealth of material that's all available at the World Digital Library online easily, but also produced a map. And this map looks a little more sophisticated, and it is more authoritative than Elphinstone's map. This is from 1834. So in 1839, what Elphinstone does is retract the revisions that he made in the second edition and went back to the first version of his map with a note saying, if you really want an authoritative map, don't look at mine, look at Burns's map. Okay? But what's going on is actually something much more complicated. And Elphinstone did not go alone to Afghanistan. In fact, he never made it to Kabul. An account of the Kingdom of Kabul is kind of a misleading. He only made it to Peshawar. Okay? And Elphinstone's mission was a diplomatic mission, and it had a number of colonial officers, including a professional mapper, a surveyor. that professional mapper or surveyor also produced a map of this region that looks, again, different than Elphinstone's map, but they're predicated on the same information. The same sources of information lead to different maps. And the most significant thing to note for our purposes is that Elphinstone establishes the epistemological framework for understanding Afghanistan as a Pashtun sort of place at its cultural core, with Kabul as its political center. Elphinstone sets this understanding of a place called Afghanistan where it's really Pashtuns that are important, and this place, that Kabul, is the most important. Okay? So that means Elphinstone does a lot of work, narrative work, in sort of rendering Afghan and Pashtun sort of synonyms. And his map kind of reflects that sensibility. Whereas the master mapper, the sort of expert mapper, distinguishes Afghans from the two major Pashtun groups. And in fact, the methodology of these maps is quite different. You can see Roman numerals here that are, I'm sorry you can't see, they're scattered about to kind of deal with the spatial disaggregation of tribal groups and identities. Elphinstone didn't use Roman numerals and scatter them. Elphinstone used larger or smaller fonts to sort of, a more prominent tribe gets bigger fonts and bigger letters. A smaller group, smaller fonts and smaller letters. So really, two different methodologies, two different sociological conclusions between people sharing the same information. And again, that is a reflection of the inconsistencies and instabilities of colonial knowledge more broadly. And I wanted to be sure to share some of that with you. Elphinstone also is big into images and drawings. There's a complex history of these drawings in Elphinstone that are so important for the rest of the world to begin to visualize Afghanistan. Elphinstone gives us the first Pashto vocabulary and is the first one to note the dialects of Pashto. And the dialectology of Pashto now is so intense. There's a lot of science on it. The visuals in Elphinstone's book explain sort of Pashtun tribalism with this chart. And so just the power of visuals in Elphinstone's book, the power of visuals generally for historians as we seek to understand other locations and cultures, are so key. And these help to explain the map of Afghanistan and Afghans themselves in Elphinstone's book. Jumping to the 20th century and our sort of end of the colonial era with Sir Olaf Carreau, his book, The Pathans, also maps this region. But it's Louis Dupree and his wife Nancy Dupree that we need to address for their mapping output. Nancy Dupree has a number of books of, like the Historical Guide to Kabul, with very excellent maps of the city, and indeed throughout the country. Louis Dupree has a map of Afghanistan in his book, but it's the ethnic map of Afghanistan that is so ubiquitous. It's really hard for me to imagine any student sort of Googling map of Afghanistan and not having an ethnic map be the first thing that jumps out. Ethnicity seems to be the tool for understanding Afghanistan. And we can trace that back to Elphinstone, but it gets resuscitated here with Louis Dupree's work, who also very clearly references Elphinstone. This is Elphinstone's portrait in Elphinstone College, looking out at the world. There's a reflection of the outer world. So Louis Dupree's book is published in 1973. It structurally resembles Elphinstone's book. Nearly 800 pages, tons of visuals. everything from A to Z, a sort of encyclopedia. And in my time in and around Afghanistan studies, I've heard both of these books referred to as the Bible for Afghanistan studies by ambassadors and students alike. Dupree and Elphinstone. What Dupree does to generate his map is in the context of his larger work in Afghanistan, where his involvement in the country was mediated by the American University Field Staff, a really curious organization that's kind of hard to track. But it was this that allowed Louis Dupree to spend half his year in Afghanistan and half his year in the United States, broadly. And those American University Field Staff reports were his main responsibility, it appears. There are hundreds of them. And they go from the 50s to the early 80s. They're an incredible reservoir of information. Much of that got filtered into the book, but much of it kind of stands alone. And what we see in those AUFS reports is kind of the gradual emergence of the ethnic map, the gradual refinement of the map in concert with local sources of information. And it's so important to note that individuals like Elphinstone and like Dupree have local translators and collaborators that become an important part of their project, even if written out of the bibliography or footnotes, sociologically at least. Really significant relationships between, we might call them sort of anthropologists and informants, for lack of a quicker way to say that. And lo and behold, it turns out that one of Louis Dupree's informants, who he thanks for the ethnic map, is none other than Ashraf Ghani, the current president of Afghanistan, who has outlawed, at least tried to, the use of tribal names in official documents. So Ashraf Ghani calls himself no longer Ahmadzai. It's such an interesting question of naming here. Ultimately, the ethnic map that is the final product that gets put into the Afghanistan book looks like this. And it's this basis that really, I'm sure you can imagine other ethnic maps of the country. So, moving forward, it's very clear to me that Professor Adamec's legacy is safe here at the University of Arizona. It's unfathomable for me to foresee a time when students of Afghanistan won't know about Professor Adamec. And through the digital library, it's really unfathomable for me for how any future student of Afghanistan can avoid or not appreciate Professor Adamec. But the challenge for us is really as his heirs, and here I have to come back to the name Adamec. Adamec, Adam, little Adam, or potentially. And in that sense, I like to think of us as sort of Adamec. We're all, I think, in some ways, children of Ludwig in that way. And children have responsibilities. And I feel that my responsibility as someone who has benefited and continues to benefit in untold ways from Professor Adamec's work is to amplify it and expand it and broaden its scope. So I'd like to propose a challenge for grant writers in the audience here at University of Arizona. Find some money and get Professor Adamec's work translated fully, accurately, all of it. All the books need translation, good translation. And by oral history, I want to say something about oral conduct. My father met Professor Adamec a few times. And in reviewing those interactions, what stands out most is his competency with dogging. In fact, such a competency that I can speak sort of about joking and the way joking, and I can say maybe a little swearing, some blue language. It's a big part of social interaction, at least between males. And what my dad remembers is that Professor Adamec was able to kind of joke with him in colloquial Kavali Farsi. And that was just, and he could tell that Professor Adamec really enjoyed it and loved the language. And that's respect, love for the culture in all its forms. And when I think of that, I am forced to think that Professor Adamec is gone. I don't know if there is an oral history of his life. I don't know if anyone sat down and gave Professor Adamec, a few weeks to narrate his life for us. But I know that my father's generation, like Professor Adamec, will be leaving. And I implore all of us to capture that generation, to capture the generation of Professor Naweed and my father broadly, because the Afghanistan they knew growing up is gone. There's certainly continuities, but radically different worlds in so many different ways, environmentally, architecturally. It's sort of lost in some ways, unless we capture it. And I would also like to propose the grant writers in the audience or on the video around the world. We need a global oral history project for the generation of Professor Adamec, of scholars of Afghanistan, but also Afghans themselves. Some of those names, I would just love to see a comprehensive translation project and a comprehensive sort of oral history project to help continue to build Afghanistan studies in ways that I'd like to think Professor Adamec might be proud. So thanks very much for all of your attention, and I look forward to carrying on the conversation. Thank you.